Aero 620, Van Tuong Peninsula, Quang Ngai Province, South Vietnam. In earthen bunkers cut into the tree line, Viet Cong riflemen lie motionless, eyes fixed on the trail below. The trail they expect a Marine patrol to walk down within the hour. 3 weeks of digging. 3 weeks of camouflage checked twice a day. 3 weeks of waiting for this exact morning. The sound comes from the wrong direction. Not the trail. Not the tree line they've been watching for hours. The sky. 6 CH-34. Choctaws drop out of low gray cloud behind their own lines, rotor wash flattening the elephant grass. Marines sliding down the ramps before the wheels touch soil. Half a mile south, landing craft ramps slam onto the sand, and M48 tanks grind forward through the surf, engines drowning out the tide. The men who built this trap are no longer behind the enemy's lines. They're standing inside a closing fist. Offshore, a Navy destroyer swings its guns toward pre-marked coordinates on the peninsula, waiting on a single radio call. For 6 days, this stretch of coastline will hold the first major battle fought entirely by American ground forces in the Vietnam War. A fight the Viet Cong planned to the smallest detail, and a fight that would end with their own ambush turned back on them. But what the men digging those bunkers didn't know was already sitting in a folder on an American intelligence officer's desk, and it would change everything before the first shot was fired. Robert Emmett O'Malley grew up in the Bronx, one of 8 children in a family that measured toughness in blocks, walked home after dark. He enlisted in the Marine Corps at 17, the kind of decision that in 1959 didn't need much explanation in a neighborhood like his. By August of 1965, Sergeant O'Malley commanded a squad in Company 1, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, men who had trained together, bunked together, and by now trusted each other with the only thing that mattered in a place like Vietnam, staying alive long enough to bring the next man home, too. His unit had arrived in country only months earlier, part of the first wave of American ground combat forces committed after President Johnson's decision to escalate beyond advisors and airstrikes. Da Nang was secure. Chu Lai, the airbase 40 miles south, was not, and every Marine on that base knew the province around it belonged, in practice, to someone else. That someone else was the 1st Viet Cong Regiment, roughly 1,500 to 2,000 fighters, organized, disciplined, and dug into the Van Tuong Peninsula for weeks before the Marines ever knew their exact position. This was not a scattered guerrilla cell. This was a regular force with mortars, recoilless rifles, and a fortified village complex, and Quang, Nam Yen, Van Tuong itself, rebuilt from the ground up into a defensive network of tunnels, spider holes, and bunkers with collapsing walls that could drop a machine gun crew into firing position in seconds. The plan, drawn up by Viet Cong commanders confident in their preparation, was patient and specific. Draw a Marine patrol into the peninsula, let them advance past the outer villages, and close the trap from 3 sides at once, pinning the Americans against the sea with nowhere left to fall back to. Would you have trusted a plan built on 3 weeks of preparation and total knowledge of the ground, even against an enemy you'd never fought at this scale before? What the Viet Cong regiment didn't count on was a defector. Days before the operation, a Viet Cong soldier crossed into South Vietnamese hands and gave up the regiment's position. Its size, its layout, its intentions. That intelligence moved fast from South Vietnamese hands to American ones, and by the time it reached Major General Lewis Walt, commander of 3 Marine Amphibious Force, the decision was already forming. Walt's staff proposed sending a reconnaissance unit first, just to confirm what the informant described. Walt said no. If the Marines tipped their hand with a probe, the regiment would scatter into the countryside, and the chance would be gone. The only option left was to hit the entire peninsula at once, with everything available. Before the Viet Cong knew, their plan had already failed. Operation Starlite was built in under 72 hours. 2 Marine battalions would land by helicopter in 3 zones, codenamed Red, White, and Blue, on the western edge of the peninsula, while a 3rd battalion came ashore by landing craft from the sea. Tanks would follow the beach assault. Destroyers offshore would range their guns onto pre-plotted targets. Artillery batteries at Chu Lai stood ready to fire in support the moment the 1st Marine touched ground. The goal was simple to say and brutal to execute. Drive the regiment east and northeast, away from the villages, into a blocking force with the ocean at their backs. The exact trap the Viet Cong had built for the Marines turned back on the men who built it. Chu Lai was not just another airstrip. It was one of the newest and most exposed American bases in Vietnam, built on sand flats and defended by little more than the Marines stationed to guard it. A regiment of that size, sitting undetected less than 10 miles from the runway, was not a nuisance to be managed later. It was a threat to the entire American foothold in the province, and every intelligence officer who read that defector's account understood it the same way. But here's what the regiment's commanders never accounted for. They had built their ambush around a single assumption, that the Americans, like the French before them, would come the way an army was expected to come, along the roads, through the villages. On the ground, they had already turned into a killing field. Nobody on that peninsula was watching the sky for 6 helicopters at once, or the horizon for a wave of landing craft. The trap was built for a patrol. What arrived was 3 battalions. Sergeant O'Malley's company. I was assigned to Landing Zone Blue, the southernmost of the helicopter insertions, tasked with sweeping north through terrain the regiment had spent weeks fortifying. Nobody in that company knew yet how close the fighting would come, or how many of the enemy positions were still occupied, still armed, still waiting for a fight they believed they would win. At Orwa 6:20 on August 18th, the first helicopters came in low over the tree line. Within minutes, it was clear the intelligence had been right about one thing above all else. This was not a handful of local guerrillas. This was a regiment, and it was not going to run. The first shots came almost gently, the way trouble in Vietnam so often did. A few scattered cracks from a tree line, a Marine going down with a leg wound, a squad returning fire into brush that gave nothing back. For the companies pushing north from Landing Zone Blue, it looked, for a few minutes, like exactly what the intelligence briefing had promised. Light resistance, a regiment still shaking off the shock of an assault it never saw coming. That impression didn't survive the hour. Within minutes, The volume of fire coming back at the advancing squads told a different story than the one written in the briefing room the night before. Near the hamlet of An Quang, Company H of the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines walked into ground that had been prepared for exactly this moment. What looked like an ordinary tree line opened into interlocking fields of fire from bunkers so well camouflaged that Marines were stepping over firing ports without seeing them. Machine guns opened up from 3 directions at once. Mortar rounds began falling with a precision that only came from crews who had walked off the distances themselves, days or weeks earlier, and marked every approach with a number. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the official summaries. The same tunnel network the Viet Cong had built to spring their ambush on a Marine patrol was now the reason the Marines couldn't simply flank around the resistance. Every position that went quiet had 2 more feeding it from underground. A bunker cleared at Oro 900 could be occupied again by Oro 30, the crew coming up through a spider hole 30 yards behind the American line. The peninsula wasn't a battlefield with a front and a rear anymore. It was a structure built for exactly this kind of fight, and the Marines were learning its architecture one casualty at a time. On the other side of that tree line, the regiment's own commanders were facing a problem their planning session had never modeled. Their ambush had been built around a single narrow assumption: 1 column, 1 direction, 1 chance to close the trap. Instead, they were fighting a battle on 3 fronts at once, cut off from easy communication between companies, unable to tell which of their own positions were still holding and which had already been overrun. Runners moved between bunkers because radios were scarce, and the noise of the fighting swallowed shouted orders within a few yards. For men who had trained for an ambush lasting minutes, this was turning into something closer to a siege, one they were now defending from the inside. Heat became its own enemy that morning. Temperatures climbed past 100 degrees by 9 o'clock, and Marines humping ammunition and water forward through rice paddies and hedgerows were fighting exhaustion as much as gunfire. Corpsmen worked in the open because there was nowhere covered to work from, dragging wounded men behind paddy dikes that offered barely a foot of cover. Every radio call for a medevac helicopter had to be weighed against a landing zone that was still in places receiving fire. By mid-morning, tanks and Antos vehicles were moving up in support, grinding through hedgerows to give infantry squads a chance to close on positions that small arms fire alone couldn't crack. Radios carried a rising volume of contact reports back to the command post. Not panic, but the unmistakable sound of a fight that was bigger and going to take longer than the plan on the map had allowed for. Offshore, the destroyer that had been waiting since dawn finally got its call. 5-inch shells began walking across pre-plotted grid squares north of An Quang, and at Chu Lai, artillery batteries that had stood loaded since SOT 600 opened fire in support missions that would run almost without pause for the rest of the day. None of it silenced the bunkers completely. It bought the infantry seconds, sometimes minutes, of cover to move. And on a morning like this one, seconds were the only currency that mattered. If you found this channel, it's probably because you already sensed that most of what gets taught about this war stopped where the official record went quiet. This channel starts exactly where those records go silent, pulling from declassified after-action reports, unit histories, and first-hand accounts to tell the parts that didn't make the press releases. If that's the kind of history you're here for, subscribe, because there's a lot more of it still buried. What nobody on either side could see yet was that the heaviest fighting of the entire operation hadn't started. It was still forming half a mile north around a hamlet whose name would end up attached to one of the costliest hours of the battle, and to the men who would earn the war's first Medal of Honor trying to hold it. The name that would end up in the after-action reports was in Quang Tu, a hamlet that looked, on the map handed out that morning, like nothing more than a cluster of huts to be swept through on the way north. On the ground, it was the hinge the entire Viet Cong defense had been built around, and it was here that Company H found itself fighting not to advance, but simply to survive contact with a force that outnumbered and nearly surrounded it. By late morning, elements of Company H were pinned down in open rice paddies, with bunkers on two sides, and no covered route forward or back. Marines who had crossed the beach at dawn expecting a sweep were now calling in danger-close artillery on positions less than 100 yards from their own line, a decision no officer makes lightly and no radio operator relays without his voice tightening. Casualties were mounting inside a perimeter that kept shrinking, and for the first time since the helicopters touched down, the outcome of the fight north of An Quang was genuinely in doubt. Company commanders further back, listening to the radio traffic, understood that a single overrun position could unravel the entire eastern flank of the operation. Inside that shrinking perimeter, men were rationing ammunition they'd carried ashore that morning, believing it would be more than enough for a light sweep through pacified villages. Radio operators kept two conversations running at once, one coordinating fire support, the other reassuring wounded Marines still conscious enough to hear that a medevac was coming, even when nobody could yet say when a helicopter would be able to land. A single machine gun position, dug into a rice paddy dike and camouflaged with cut grass, had already accounted for more casualties in 20 minutes than the company had expected to take in the entire operation. Would you have held that position, knowing reinforcements were still a mile away, and closing slowly through hedgerows the enemy had zeroed in weeks earlier? The Marines of Company H didn't have the luxury of debating the question. They dug in, returned fire in short, disciplined bursts to conserve ammunition, and waited for a decision being made several hundred yards to the rear that none of them could see. This was the moment the entire operation pivoted on. Colonel Oscar Petros, commanding the landing force, made the call to commit reserves. Company Y, still fresh off landing zone blue, would move north immediately to relieve the pressure on Company H. Cutting across ground, the Viet Cong had already proven they would defend inch by inch. It was a decision built on the same logic that had shaped the whole operation from the start. Better to throw overwhelming force at a confirmed position than to feed men into an unclear fight piece by piece. Tanks would move with the relief column this time, their 90mm guns able to do in one round what a squad of riflemen might not manage with an entire belt of ammunition against a fortified bunker. The ground between Landing Zone Blue and An Quang Tu offered nothing in the way of cover. Open paddies broken by low dikes, a scattering of hedgerows that could hide a bunker as easily as a resting water buffalo, and heat that had by now pushed past 105 degrees. Every man in company, I understood, without needing it explained, that they would be crossing that ground under observation the entire way, and that the same regiment that had nearly encircled Company H had more than enough strength left to do the same to the relief column. Sergeant Robert O'Malley's squad was among the first ordered forward. What they were about to walk into hadn't fully registered yet. Not the scale of it, not what it would cost, and not what one 22-year-old sergeant from the Bronx was about to do in the next hour to keep as many of his men alive as he could. The tree line ahead had gone quiet in the way that only meant one thing to men who had already spent 5 hours learning this ground's language. It wasn't over. It was reloading. Company, I hit the tree line south of An Quang Tu at a run, and the ground answered immediately. Machine gun fire raked across the paddy from at least 2 bunkers the earlier fighting hadn't located, and within the first minute, Marines were down in the open with no cover closer than a shallow dike 30 yards back. Sergeant O'Malley's squad was among the first exposed, caught in a stretch of paddy with fire coming from the front and, moments later, from the flank as well. The kind of crossfire that Viet Cong defenders had spent 3 weeks positioning their guns to create. O'Malley didn't wait for orders that weren't coming fast enough to matter. He led his squad in a direct assault on the nearest firing position, closing the distance under fire rather than pulling back to find cover. The kind of decision that either ends a fight in minutes or ends a lot more than that. The position went silent. Then another opened up 30 yards further on, and the pattern repeated. Close the distance, take the position, move to the next one. Because in this terrain, standing still under fire was its own kind of death sentence. It was in the middle of that assault that the real cost of the morning caught up with his squad. Several Marines went down within a few minutes of each other, hit crossing open ground with no way to reach cover without exposing themselves to the same guns that had already found the range. What happened next took less than 4 minutes, and it would be the reason a sergeant from the Bronx came home wearing the Medal of Honor. O'Malley went back for them. Not once, 3 separate times, moving into the open under direct fire to drag wounded Marines to what little cover the paddy dikes offered, absorbing hits of his own in the process. He was wounded during the 3rd trip, hit badly enough that any reasonable measure of the situation said he was done fighting for the day. He didn't leave. He organized what remained of his squad into a defensive position, directed their fire to cover the approach for a medevac, and refused evacuation himself until every wounded man under his command had been moved to safety first. Would you have made that 3rd trip, knowing what the first 2 had already cost you? It's the kind of question that's easy to answer from a chair decades later and almost impossible to answer honestly in the 4 minutes it actually took. The bunker system around An Quang Tu revealed itself the way these things always did in this kind of terrain. Not all at once, but position by position, each one a fresh surprise even to Marines who thought They'd already learned the pattern. A firing port disguised as a termite mound, a spider hole hidden under a woven grass mat that looked, from 10 feet away, like nothing more than part of the paddy dike. Marines were learning, in real time and at brutal cost, that the map handed out that morning bore almost no relationship to the defensive network actually buried beneath this ground. Ammunition became the second enemy. Squads that had crossed the beach that morning, carrying what should have been more than enough for a light sweep, were now radioing back requests for resupply mid-firefight, a request that meant someone else would have to cross the same open ground under the same guns to deliver it. Corpsmen ran low on battle dressings by early afternoon and began using whatever cloth was available torn from uniforms to slow bleeding long enough to get a man to a helicopter. Around him, the wider fight for An Quang Tu had reached the point where distinguishing between advance and survival stopped mattering. Marines cleared bunkers with grenades because there was no time or angle for anything more careful, and every position taken carried the risk that a tunnel 30 yards back would put an enemy gunner right back where he'd started. The heat alone was taking men out of the fight. Corpsmen were now treating heat casualties alongside gunshot and shrapnel wounds, working in the open because there was nowhere else to work. But here's what the after-action reports would later confirm, and what nobody fighting that afternoon could have known yet. The arrival of Company R and the tanks now grinding up behind them was the beginning of the end for the Viet Cong regiment's ability to hold this ground. Not because the fighting was about to get easier, it wasn't, not for hours yet, but because the numbers had finally turned. What started as a battalion pinned down by a numerically superior force was becoming, block by block, an assault the regiment no longer had the strength in this sector to stop. By early afternoon, the perimeter around An Quang Tu had stabilized enough for medevac helicopters to begin working the landing zone in earnest, ferrying out wounded under covering fire from Marines who, hours earlier, had been fighting simply to keep that same stretch of ground from being overrun. O'Malley, still refusing evacuation, kept his remaining squad organized and in position until he was satisfied every one of his wounded had a seat on a helicopter before he would even discuss taking one himself. The fight for this single hamlet, a cluster of huts that had looked on a map that morning like nothing worth naming, had cost more casualties in a few hours than most companies expected to take in a full deployment. It would also produce the first Medal of Honor awarded to a United States Marine in the Vietnam War, and a case study that would be taught for years on what it actually costs to hold ground against an enemy who built that ground to kill you. By mid-afternoon, the shape of the battle had changed, and it changed because of three things arriving almost simultaneously. Tanks finally in position to fire directly into bunker apertures at point-blank range. Close air support making low runs over confirmed Viet Cong positions, and naval gunfire from the destroyer offshore, now walking systematically across grid squares the regiment had thought were safe rear positions. The tanks made the difference first. An M48 firing a single 90mm round into a bunker aperture did in one shot what an infantry squad might spend 20 minutes and several casualties trying to accomplish with rifles and grenades alone. Marines began advancing behind armor for the first time since the landing, using the tanks as moving cover, while riflemen picked off anything the main gun didn't silence outright. It wasn't elegant. It worked. And by this point in the day, working was the only standard that mattered. Overhead, Marine and Navy aircraft ran strike after strike on positions called in by forward observers who now had a clearer picture of the regiment's layout than anyone had that morning. Napalm and bombs fell on tree lines that had concealed machine gun positions for hours, and while the strikes didn't end the resistance outright, they broke something in its rhythm, the steady, disciplined rate of fire that had defined the morning's fighting began, position by position, to falter. What would you have prioritized in that moment? Pressing the advantage while the enemy was disorganized, or consolidating to protect against a counterattack that command still believed was possible? The officers on the ground chose both, pushing forward, company by company, while keeping enough reserve strength in position to respond if the regiment tried to break out toward the sea rather than retreat inland. That is, in the end, what the regiment chose to do, rather than continue fighting for ground that was costing them more each hour. Viet Cong units began withdrawing westward and northward, away from the peninsula and away from the trap that blocking forces had spent all day trying to close around them. It wasn't a rout. Vietnamese regular forces of this caliber didn't break and run. They disengaged in the way trained units do, covering each other's withdrawal, using the same tunnel network that had helped them defend the ground to help them abandon it without being caught in the open. Small rearguard elements stayed behind at key positions, specifically to slow the American advance long enough for the bulk of the regiment to disperse into the countryside beyond the blocking forces. A costly decision for the men left to make it, but one that likely saved the regiment itself from being destroyed outright that day. For Sergeant O'Malley and the remnants of his squad, the arrival of armor meant something more immediate than tactics. It meant the wounded still waiting near An Quang too finally had a secure enough perimeter for medevac helicopters to work without drawing fire on every approach. The rhythm of the afternoon shifted from assault to evacuation, tank crews and infantry holding ground, while corpsmen and litter teams moved as fast as the heat and the terrain allowed. The naval gunfire support proved, in its own way, as decisive as anything happening on the ground. The destroyer offshore had been firing in support missions since mid-morning, and by afternoon, its 5-inch guns were reaching positions well behind the regiment's forward defenses, places Viet Cong commanders had likely assumed were beyond the range of anything the Marines could bring to bear from the beach. That assumption cost them freedom of movement at exactly the moment they needed it most, as units attempting to reposition or resupply found themselves caught in the open under fire from a source they couldn't see and couldn't answer. By evening, the intensity that had defined the day's fighting had eased into something closer to a manhunt. American units pushing through cleared positions, finding tunnel entrances and equipment caches abandoned in haste, but finding fewer and fewer live enemy fighters willing to make a stand. The regiment that had built this ground into a killing field for a Marine patrol had been driven off of it, at a cost neither side had expected when the sun came up that morning. When the fighting finally quieted on August 19th, the numbers came in slowly, the way they always did. First estimates, then confirmed counts, then the kind of adjustments that kept coming for days as units swept the battlefield and found what the chaos of the fight hadn't allowed anyone to record in real time. 45 Marines had been killed. Over 200 more had been wounded, many of them, like Sergeant O'Malley, refusing evacuation until the men in front of them had a seat on a helicopter first. Viet Cong losses were far heavier. The regiment that had planned this ambush lost several hundred fighters killed, along with a substantial store of weapons, ammunition, and equipment captured or destroyed across the peninsula. Both totals would be revised in the days that followed, as sweeps continued through positions too dangerous to fully clear on the first day. Numbers alone don't carry what that day cost. They don't carry the corpsman who worked through the afternoon heat with dressings torn from his own uniform because the resupply couldn't reach him in time. They don't carry the radio operator who kept two conversations running for hours, one calling in artillery, the other telling a wounded friend that help was coming because both jobs mattered, and there was no one else to do either. They don't carry what it meant for a 22-year-old sergeant to make a third trip into open ground under fire, already wounded, because leaving even one man behind wasn't a decision he was willing to make. And they don't carry what it meant for the families back in places like the Bronx, waiting on a telegram that either came or didn't, with no way yet to know which kind of mourning this had been for their son. For the villages on the peninsula, An Quang, Nam Yen, Van Tuong itself, the cost was different, and, in its own way, just as heavy. Homes that had stood for generations were destroyed in the fighting. Caught in the same battle, their fields and tree lines had been turned into a battlefield to fight. Families who had lived under Viet Cong presence for years, sometimes willingly, and sometimes because there was no other option available to them, now found their fields cratered, their homes burned, and their livelihoods gone in the space of a single day. Civilians who had lived under Viet Cong control for years now found themselves in the middle of the first large-scale conventional battle of an American war that was only beginning, with no clear sense of what came next, or the ground they called home. But here's what the after-action reports didn't fully capture at the time. The intelligence recovered from captured bunkers and abandoned equipment gave American commanders their first real look at how a Viet Cong main force regiment organized, supplied, and fought a set-piece defense. Documents, weapons caches, and prisoner interrogations from Operation Starlite would shape how the Marine Corps planned every major operation in your Corps for years afterward. The cost of this single day of fighting bought knowledge that would, for better or worse, define the next several years of the war in this part of Vietnam. For the regiment itself, the cost went beyond the dead and wounded left behind. Operation Starlite proved something the Viet Cong command would have to account for in every plan that followed. A fortified position, however well built, could be overwhelmed by a force willing to bring tanks, air power, and naval gunfire to bear all at once, in coordination, on a single confirmed target. The tunnels and bunkers that had made this ground nearly impossible to take by infantry alone hadn't saved the regiment from a fight fought on different terms than the one they'd prepared for. For the Marines who walked off that peninsula on August 24th, when the operation officially concluded, the cost was measured in something harder to put in an after-action report. The knowledge that this was what the rest of the war was likely to look like, fought a village and a tree line at a time, against an enemy who would keep adapting to whatever the Marines brought to the fight next. Operation Starlite mattered beyond the numbers, and it mattered in ways the Marines who fought it couldn't fully see while they were still fighting it. This was the first time American ground forces had engaged a Viet Cong main force regiment in a battle of this scale, and the result reshaped how senior commanders thought about the war ahead. General Westmoreland and his staff read the after-action reports as confirmation that conventional American firepower, tanks, air support, naval gunfire, artillery, all brought to bear in coordination, could defeat even a well-prepared, well-dug-in enemy regiment. That conclusion would drive the strategy of search and destroy operations for years to come. What it didn't fully account for was the other lesson buried in the same reports. The regiment hadn't been destroyed. It had been driven off the ground, at a cost the Marines could absorb once, but couldn't sustain as a standard rate of exchange across an entire war. Not with a war that was still, in August of 1965, only beginning to escalate. The tunnels, the bunkers, the discipline of a force that could disengage under fire without collapsing, all of it would reappear again and again in battles across our corps for years afterward. Starlite proved American forces could win a set-piece fight against a Viet Cong regiment. It didn't prove they could win the war being fought underneath that ground, in a network the regiment had built once and could always build again somewhere else. There is also this, a detail that rarely makes it past the tactical summary. The intelligence that made Starlite possible came from a single defector, a man who crossed the lines for reasons the historical record doesn't fully preserve. One decision by one soldier changed the outcome for thousands of men on both sides of that peninsula. History rarely announces which individual choice is about to matter most. It only shows you afterward that one of them did. The Marines who planned this operation got the intelligence right, moved fast, and brought overwhelming force to a fight they didn't have to walk into unprepared. That is, by any measure, a tactical success, and it was paid for by 45 families who received a telegram they never wanted, and by hundreds more who spent the rest of that August in field hospitals learning to live with what the fighting had cost them. Sergeant O'Malley would spend weeks recovering from his wounds before word even reached him that his actions that day were being reviewed for the nation's highest military honor. The institution that sent these men ashore that morning would go on to fight this same kind of battle on this same kind of ground dozens of times more before the war was finished. Whether it ever fully learned what Van Tuong Peninsula was trying to teach it that day is a question that outlasted the war itself, and one that the men who fought there never stopped being asked to answer for. What you just watched happened. Van Tuong is a real place, The regiment was real. The men who crossed that beach at dawn were real. Starlite got called a victory, and by the numbers, it was won. But victories like this came with a bill that kept getting sent, year after year, to men who'd already paid it once. The institution got a lot right that morning. It didn't always get the years afterward right for the men who carried it home. That doesn't make what they did less. It makes it more. If any part of this felt personal, the description below has real resources. The men who served this country still deserve support, long after that last shot was fired.